June 1944. The Second World War had reached a critical moment. The only way to stop Hitler in his tracks and to reclaim lost territory was to launch the largest seaborne invasion in history, the moment that became known as D-Day.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you.
The D-Day invasion was spearheaded by paratroopers. Leaping into the unknown, their job was to prevent enemy reinforcements. Without their actions, Allied victory in the West would not have been possible.
I have to tell you, everybody says we're heroes, and that isn't true. We volunteered to do this, we trained to do it, and we were paid to do it. That does not make you a hero.
There could have been no spearhead and no paratroopers without the workhorses of the sky, the Douglas C-47s, the airplanes that flew in their hundreds across the English Channel to Normandy. Charged with delivering the airborne divisions to their rendezvous with destiny, one airplane had to lead the way.
It seemed totally beyond comprehension that the airplane that led the D-Day invasion, this incredibly important artifact, would be in a scrapyard. There's just no way that that can be true.
I just had a feeling there's something special about this airplane. And he said, well, that airplane was the lead plane into Normandy.
This is the story of the men who found and who were determined to restore this iconic aircraft, of the plane's part in one defining moment in history, and of a dream that she should fly again back to the coast of France to commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day. That's All Brother, the plane that led the D-Day invasion.
At the end of May 1944, the whole of northwestern Europe was under Nazi control. But that was about to change. Before any invasion could take place, the Allies needed air superiority. And in the weeks leading up to D-Day, the RAF and the US Army Air Forces combined in a concerted series of attacks on the German aviation infrastructure. They bombed factories, they attacked airfields and aircraft storage depots. New tactics unleashed fighters to sweep the skies of Europe, so that when D-Day came, aerial supremacy would be in the grip of the Allies. And the troops landing on the beaches, under the shield of Allied fighter protection, suffered minimal interference from the Luftwaffe.
For the invasion to stand any chance of success, it was imperative that the Allies first secured strategic objectives behind enemy lines. The only way to achieve this was to drop troops in from the air. This was a new tactic, only fully developed in World War II, and the C-47 Skytrain was derived from the civilian Douglas DC-3 airliner to fulfill this role.
It was a great airplane to fly. I thought they should make one in gold and put it on top of a mountain. I've got about 2,000 hours in C-47s, yeah. But I love the airplane. It's the most forgiving airplane in the world. And, well, you know, it wasn't made by mistake.
Without the C-47, you don't have any paratroopers. We're not very emotional, but most of us are emotional about a C-47. I can't explain it. Most of them would give the right arm to ride in a C-47 today.
Over 10,000 C-47s were built between 1943 and 1945, and it proved to be one of the most durable and successful of all transport planes.
When the war came along, the inventory was studied to see what was available. And with the Douglas commercial transport, you had an aircraft that could carry paratroopers far more effectively than any other aircraft of the time. As a civilian transport plane, it left behind the corrugated fabric covered aircraft of the era. It took air travel in America a leap forward. People could fly in comfort, with speed, with heat, and a lot more safety because the aircraft was designed to be able to fly on one engine. Many twin-engine aircraft of the era could not. If you lost an engine, you were done for. With the DC-3 and the later C-47, you lost an engine, you could keep flying.
Just as these planes were being built, new shock troops had to be trained in this new form of combat. And so, in time, were born the Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions.
They were going to have a special unit such as the Army had never had before. And it was going to be run by a guy named Colonel Sink. 6,500 people applied and were accepted. He didn't want old Army people in there at all because they had old ways. He wanted all new people straight out of civilian life. The discipline was instantaneous and terrible. The least miscalculation or any problem, you're out. They sent you to 27th Infantry Division. The food was awful. And if you didn't get in line, the last 3 or 4 guys may not get anything, and that was by design. It was so bad that he had us all sit on a hillside one day and said, "I hear you people aren't happy." "Yeah." "You don't like the food?" "No." "You think I'm too hard on you?" "Yeah." He said, "Well, I'm going to tell you, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse before it gets any better." And then he walked away, and that was it. Now, we hated him during that training, absolutely hated that man. But when we got to combat and saw how he operated, there isn't a man wouldn't have followed him to hell and back.
But what of the plane that led the invasion, the very tip of the spearhead? She was neither remembered nor accounted for. Had she, in fact, been lost to history? Apparently, no one knew. Then, by chance, 2 military historians, Matt Scales and Ken Tilley, found themselves in possession of some key evidence that might help to resolve the mystery of the missing plane.
I heard a rumor that a member of our squadron had flown the lead C-47 on D-Day. And I thought, and I knew who the pilot was, John Donaldson. He had been a member of my squadron since 1924. And so when I hear this rumor, I said, no, that's the wrong kind of plane. It's the wrong part of the world. So where's this coming from? So in the summer of 2007, I had the opportunity to go to the Air Force Historical Research Agency on a temporary assignment, actually, at the time. And I met up with another historian named Ken Tilley, and he's also from Alabama, and we're actually from the same small hometown up in the northern part of the state. And because of that, I told him, because John Donaldson was from Alabama, so I said, can we figure out, where this rumor is coming from? He said, yeah, let's look it up. So, and looked into the Pathfinders. Those were fairly well documented, saw, okay, he didn't fly a Pathfinder aircraft. Okay, well, what's the main wave, the lead wave behind the Pathfinders? Find out that it's the 438 Troop Carrier Group. And so Ken takes me up to the 3rd floor of the archives, and we pulled the 438's history. And there's a picture of John Donaldson as the commander of the group. And so I was like, wow, okay, so he is there. And we pulled the June history, and we look at it, and it says, Colonel John Donaldson, along with Lieutenant Colonel David Daniel, took off in C-47 4292847. And we were floored, because it's very rare for even partial tail numbers to be listed in histories. It's unheard of for full tail numbers to be listed in histories. And so when we saw that, we were my attention at that point immediately shifted to the aircraft.
Having established that John Donaldson had indeed transferred squadrons and flown the aircraft that led the invasion, Matt then set about tracing the serial number, 4292847. To his surprise, he discovered that the plane still existed, but her fate was uncertain. She was in the boneyard at Basler Turbo Conversions at Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where many airplanes are given a new life, but only after major, irreversible modification.
A chill ran down my spine when I saw that it went to Basler. I was familiar with Basler. I knew, what they did, and I thought, don't get me wrong, Basler is a great company. and I like their product. I really do. I think it's cool what they do and a way they breathe new life into these airplanes. But at the same time, all I could think was there's so many DC-3s and C-47s out there. Why this one? And so I actually called Basler and said, hey, I don't know if you know, but this airplane led the invasion of Normandy. And they were very nice, very, very nice. And they thanked me for the information. And again, I understand they got a job to do. They got a business to run, and I don't fault them for that. And I said, just thought I'd let you know. And they said, okay, thank you. And so I just thought, well, that's all I can do.
Some years later, Matt, as a proactive member of online warbird communities, discovered that the lead plane, thought to be named in wartime Belle of Birmingham and usually assigned to Donaldson and his crew, might be up for sale. This could only mean that she was still intact. By good fortune, a member of the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying warbird collection, was then alerted to the story.
I distinctly remember a few weeks after joining the CAF, I read a blog article from Whitman Regional Airport, and it caught my attention because it was where I used to live and work in Oshkosh. And it seemed to be saying that the airplane that led the D-Day invasion was sitting in the boneyard at Basler. And that really caught my attention because just from my own history, I knew that boneyard and I knew the kind of stuff that was hanging around there. And the idea that an airplane that had a significant place in history had been basically rediscovered really captured my attention. And now I'm working for the CAF, the world's leading World War II aviation preservation flying museum, and I'm thinking, wow, this could be a great opportunity. This is the kind of airplane that this organization should aspire to own.
Doug Rozendaal, the chairman of the CAF, as well as an experienced C-47 pilot, knows the value of preserving these aircraft for future generations.
So the CAF was founded over 50 years ago by some crop dusters in South Texas, who quite frankly were probably most honestly trying to figure out a way to make their fun World War II fighter airplanes tax deductible. It's grown into a lot more than that. We've been in existence for over 50 years. We're the largest flying museum in the world, have the largest collection of flying World War II airplanes with approximately 170 planes that we operate. They're scattered all across the country and in some foreign countries. And we use those airplanes as a tool to tell a story. And we use those stories to inspire young people to realize that they can overcome adversity, that there was a time in our history, not really that long ago, when our way of life was really in peril.
The mystery of the missing plane appealed to the CAF, and it fell to Keegan to try to prove the provenance of the aircraft.
One of our CAF staffers, who is from Wisconsin, sort of keeps track of his hometown news stories. And he kind of brought it to me with the, can this really be true? It seemed quite unbelievable. In reading the materials that were assembled, there was a number of sort of factual inaccuracies that sort of made it believable that the whole story was in fact false. The name of the airplane, for instance, was identified as Belle of Birmingham because this had been the name of Colonel Donaldson's aircraft. Mind you, the story of Belle of Birmingham was known. That airplane was cut up. It was well documented. So there was this name, there was a serial number referenced, but there wasn't a real clear link between the two. And so it lent itself to some questioning and skepticism around the claim that Matt was making. So I originally set out to disprove it.
First came the need to sort out fact from fiction. Keegan began with the serial number and, cross-referencing it against the aircraft's record card, he discovered that it had departed for England. He also confirmed that, as part of the 9th Troop Carrier Command, she belonged to the squadron of planes that was to drop the first regular troops into Normandy. What Keegan needed now was one further piece of evidence confirming Matt's findings that this was the lead plane.
One afternoon while we were searching, we stumbled into a company that has been digitizing films possessed by the National Archives here in the United States. And in one such search, we did find the serial number. So clicking on the film reel, we learned that the film was shot on the night of June 5th, right before the D-Day invasion began. And so we watched the film reel and realized only a couple minutes in that we were looking at 4292847 as the lead ship. The film showed the airplane, showed the generals sending it off. The film actually allowed us to confirm that the airplane had led the D-Day invasion.
So how did this detailed archive footage, shot the day before D-Day at the airbase from which the first planes left, come to be filmed?
Greenham Common, England. When Eisenhower came here on the 5th of June, he was accompanied by a retinue, the press corps, the media, members of the publicity and psychological warfare section. He'd helped establish this. He knew the value of propaganda. The publicity and psychological warfare section was established to disseminate both black and white propaganda. Black would, of course, be like fake news today, to disturb and disrupt and confuse the enemy. White propaganda would be nearer the truth. It would be for the folks back home to help sell war bonds. Cameramen filmed a relaxed Eisenhower with the troops. They also filmed in detail the aircraft being prepared and paratroopers boarding, including the aircraft that would be leading the operation that day.
With confirmation of the plane's serial number, there still remained the question of her name. As Keegan had confirmed, the Belle of Birmingham was no more. So what was her identity?
As the cameras zoomed in on the airplane and panned around it, there was a great deal of attention paid to this aircraft. It was obvious that the cameramen knew the historic significance of what they were looking at. And as the camera panned past the nose, the name "That's All Brother" appeared on the screen. And at that one instant in time, we realized, wow, this is its name. This is the story. This incredible airplane has been lost. And we're sitting here, and it's been found. And at the same moment, the thought entered our minds that, what if we can't save it? We knew that it was at Basler, and we knew that Basler has a degree of efficiency about converting these airplanes. And we sort of leapt from that office into action because we had to be able to find out what had happened to this airplane. We had to know if it was something that was in our power to save, if there was anything that we could do. And it turns out that there was.
Finally, the correct name for the serial number had been found, alleviating Keegan's earlier doubts about the plane's provenance. The CAF were now driven by the need to acquire That's All Brother, and, in time, they struck a mutually satisfactory deal with Basler for her purchase and restoration.
I bought this airplane probably more than 10 years ago, and I just had a feeling there was something with this airplane, so we never brought it through for conversion. I always moved it to the back of the line. Every time it came up for conversion, I pushed it to the back, just because I had this gut feeling there's something special about this airplane. And I'm glad we did, because now, had we not done that, this airplane would have been flying somewhere else in the world as a BT-67 with turbine engines on it. So we're bringing it in and bringing it back to the day it left the Douglas factory back in 1942. We're going to put it back to all original specifications as the day it left. And we're ecstatic. You know, without the CAF, this airplane wouldn't last or wouldn't be kept in the condition that it was without them.
It turns out that Doug's history of flying C-47s was linked to this very plane also.
This particular airplane was purchased by a friend of mine probably 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, and he called me and asked me to check him out in it. I trained him, checked him out, we flew it together quite a bit, and he just didn't have the time to campaign the airplane on the airshow circuit like he would want. He was trying to sell the airplane, he was trying to convince me to buy it, and I just didn't have need for a DC-3 or the ability to take care of it. So ultimately, he sold it here to Basler Turbo Conversions and called me and asked me to fly it here with him. So we flew the airplane up here, parked it out on the ramp just outside the building, and I admit unashamedly that when I walked away from it, I had a tear in my eye knowing that this airplane's days as a DC-3 were over. Fast forward, I think 7 years, and it became known that this airplane was That's All Brother, the airplane that led the D-Day raid. And fortunately, we at the CAF were able to acquire this airplane and bring it back to its former glory and preserve this iconic piece of American history.
I think the first time that I saw the airplane up in Oshkosh, there was no nose art, anything like that. And there really wasn't anyone around. And it was profound to look up at this airplane and realize a string of lucky chances kept this airplane and kept it for us, waiting for us. It was over at Basler, and had it been a few aircraft ahead in the line, it would have already been gone. I guess the gravity of the whole thing was actually that it had survived. And what really struck home was I climbed up inside the airplane and I stopped and stood in the doorway and realized, for whatever else that may have changed about the airplane, that door threshold hadn't. That was the door that those 101st Airborne Paratroopers jumped out of. And a thought passed into my mind that when the 101st was established, their founding commander pointed out to the men while they were all assembled in a field that their division, the 101st Airborne Division, had no history, but that they were a division that had a rendezvous with destiny. And at that moment I realized, this is the door. This is where those men stepped out to attend that rendezvous with destiny. And that was a powerful thought. It's just sort of stopped me in my tracks, and it's still something that when I reflect on that moment, takes me back to this whole story and the excitement of finding the airplane.
January 1944. As the date for invasion drew closer, there was an urgent need for more C-47s. That's All Brother was being built, along with some 400 others, as part of a rush contract. She was accepted into the Army Air Force on March the 8th, a mere 3 months ahead of D-Day. The immediacy of her mission meant that the plane flew via the Atlantic Bridge directly to the UK.
Europe was at war. Aircraft were vitally needed. The Atlantic Air Bridge was a vital supply chain for aircraft essential for the RAF and the United States Army Air Forces in Europe, flying from North American factories through Canada to Greenland to Iceland, over the treacherous icy wastes and the seas, coming in to Scotland and then to the frontline operations in England. Nowadays you can board a jet airliner in Europe and fly non-stop over the Atlantic. In those days the aircraft did not have the range to do it.
By the time she reached Greenham Common in the south of England, there were mere weeks of preparation until her defining moment. A defining moment for everyone.
At the time this happened, World War II happened, most kids had never been out of their own county. You didn't travel. None of us had ever been in an airplane. Over the Midwest, many of them had never seen an airplane. And all of a sudden, all of the things you read about Europe, all the big cities, all the big churches and everything, we're going to go see all that stuff for free. We get to see that. We get to live some of the history that we read about and all the battles that were there at that time. Yeah. Can you imagine what that's like for a bunch of kids that never been anyplace? I have told many people I got much more out of my service than I ever put into it.
At Basler, the restoration work is underway.
Well, we take an original seat and we get these same dimensions, and then we proceed to try and roll this to the same shape, and then we put the brackets on. We generally use the original brackets, but we generally change the skin because the original seats were made out of magnesium, and magnesium had a tendency to crack. So what we see is a lot of patching over patches, and eventually you have so many patches that it doesn't do any good. Right here is one of the seat bottoms, and it's kind of a complex shape. We've got a lot of radius and stuff, and so we've actually made a fixture that we could take this particular part and we could press this out, and it's the same as the original. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of work involved in them.
Thankfully, the folks here at Basler, because of their work on the BT67 turbo conversions, they have all of these parts in stock. And so there is nothing on a C-47 that they can't do relatively easily. And it's wonderful to see, you know, what 30 years ago you could find all across America. It's really exciting to be in a place like this and see the hands and the minds and the talent that exist in this restoration process.
Having saved the aircraft, the CAF's plan, in the light of her historical importance, is to return That's All Brother to France in 2019 as part of the D-Day anniversary celebrations. To achieve this ambitious goal, she must be in perfect flying condition to fly the arduous journey over the Atlantic, retracing her former steps.
This was the airplane that led the raid. There were some airplanes that went ahead of this airplane that were called Pathfinders. But when the actual we're going to go, this very airplane that we're sitting in today was the airplane that launched out. And it came back and made 2 or 3 more trips later that day as well. Sometimes we get a little wrapped up in the provenance. At the end of the day, that provenance is important, but what's really important is the story that this airplane and others like it have to tell. Our audience is those that would ask, what kind of an airplane is that, and what did it do, and why is it important? But it's always better, more exciting, more intriguing to have the real thing. And in this case, we have that, and that's really special. Well, certainly the ultimate goal is to take this airplane back to D-Day, to the coast of France in 2019 for the 75th anniversary of the invasion.
So the plan is clear, albeit ambitious, but already time is at a premium and the pressure is on.
Once it was found out that the history of it and the process that took place, it's now a very unique experience for me to be looking for parts to restore it, that's something that normally we haven't dealt with. New surplus is the way we describe it. And yes, we have a warehouse there where the company has, whenever available, we have purchased the parts for the C-47, and we do have a large reserve that we draw from on a regular basis, and it does make the process much easier and more complete. I've got the hydraulic landing gear pressure gauge here, and it was packaged in March of '45, and it remains unopened. So sort of early Christmas each time we get to do this. They packed it with a desiccant. We're looking for a serviceable gauge to use on That's All Brother. This one I'll have to go out and look again for another one.
Though there are gauges to hand, it is by no means certain that an intact, serviceable replacement is amongst them. On such small but vital details do these restorations and ultimately lives depend.
If we can find one that there's no corrosion or anything, we'll have it sent in to make sure that it is serviceable gauge, and then we'll be able to install that onto the aircraft. Now this one looks in better shape than the first one that I had opened. Don't have the corrosion on it, so this would be a good candidate for
to send in and have it tested and certified.
The planes that preceded the main paratroop drop were called Pathfinder aircraft. Their mission was to drop Pathfinder units to establish the drop zones and set up radar systems to guide the main paratroop force.
They told us everything about the airborne operation, what time they were hitting the beaches. We knew pretty well the whole scheme of what was programmed. And it's just as well we did. We only lost one plane in Normandy, and we got the whole crew and all the parachutists back. Because the plane ditched, it got hit by anti-aircraft fire, put out an engine from the island of Sark. And they landed in the water, right next to a Canadian Corvette. They've got their feet wet, but they stepped off onto the nets. It was off the side of the Corvette. The Corvette had to sink the airplane because it was a hazard to navigation. But I saw it as the beginning of the end, yeah. But then I thought it would be sooner than it was, but no, it wasn't.
Following the Pathfinder units came the first wave of paratroopers. However, by then, the weather and enemy activity had significantly worsened.
We went across the channel. There was high cirrus clouds, so you could still see the shadows on the water below. And of course, you got all this equipment on you, and you know, in your pockets and everything, and it's pushing into you, and very uncomfortable. And then you've got bullets coming up through the floor and going out the ceiling, and you see that going on, and you think, you know, should I get up and move here? How about over there? I don't know. And then somebody gets shot laying on the floor, and you look at the guy and you think, damn, let's get it. Everybody says, let's get the hell out of here. Come on, let's get out of here. That's what they did. They said, hey, we want out. Let's go. Let's go. What's holding it up? Your adrenaline is running, and if you can't assuage that adrenaline, it ruins you. It's hard on you, mentally and physically. And so you're sitting there and you can't do anything about it. And so the instinct then is to get away from the position you're in. Getting out that door looks better than staying there. And that's the feeling of everybody.
We're at the American Cemetery in Normandy, and amongst the thousands of graves, young men resting here, we found one, William D. Cross, from the 101st Airborne. But he died on June the 6th, 1944, in that first wave. William Cross was one of those 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, the young men that leapt out of the aircraft, including That's All brother. So she, as we move on in history, will take that story forward and will honour and remember the young men that leapt from that C-47. This is humbling. There aren't words really that you can use, you just feel it. You look at this and you look at the cost and you think of the lives. It's very powerful. And it's powerful in the sense also that what the CAF are trying to do with That's All brother is to keep that story alive so that the thousands of young men here aren't forgotten. Freedom isn't free, and this makes that point more clearly than anywhere else you will ever find.
At the end of the war, and as anticipated, many of the C-47s were destroyed or disposed of in theatre. However, some survived, luckily including That's All brother. She was declared surplus to requirement by the Air Force, transported back to the US, and sent to Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, an established boneyard. From there, she was fortunate to be sold into civilian hands to undertake a wide variety of jobs, transporting both people and cargo, and undergoing several modifications.
This airplane at some point in its life had an executive interior in it, and insulation was fitted between these bell formers here, and then an interior was put in, and when it was somewhere along the line it was converted back to a freighter, and they put a cargo liner in here and failed to take out the insulation, and that insulation trapped water. So from the floorboards to the ceiling, the entire airframe that we're sitting in right now was riddled with corrosion, and much of these formers and stringers that you see here have been replaced already.
Following further inspections, the corrosion in the aircraft's fuselage was found to be significantly worse than they had originally thought. Huge sections had to be replaced. Vital work, doing nothing to relieve the time pressures.
Okay, here we have a part that came off the aircraft, and it's been inspected, and we found some corrosion on it. We can't clean this up and reuse it. We definitely have to make a new one. We've got it's cracked there, it's got some corrosion cracking in here, and we just can't repair that part, so we're going to make a brand new one. We don't happen to have these in stock at all, so we have to produce this again. So this is another example where we have to take this original part, we'll put it on a piece of phenolic, we'll trace it out, we'll grind it out, we'll grind all the correct angles on it, we'll make another template, and then we'll form it, and then we'll go through our inspection process, and then we'll go on our airplane.
The next major attack is to take on the wiring. This airplane, when I was flying it previously, was an incredibly good running, well-operating airplane in every respect except electrical. And the electrical system in it was kind of a nightmare. And we're going to tear out all of the electrical wiring in the airplane and start from scratch. So we're going to solve that problem in this restoration. So the engines will come off shortly. That's a relatively straightforward process. They'll go out and they'll be overhauled and brought back and put on. There's still a lot of radial engines in service, both in the commercial service and in the museum/airshow warbird community. So we have good access to good overhaulers, and that piece is fairly straightforward. Again, the most challenging part is money.
Not all the C-47s that survived were sold into civilian service. Some were retained by the military and took part in the Berlin airlift and the Korean and Vietnam Wars. In this latter conflict, it became clear that, thanks to their slow speed and their stability, C-47s were ideally suited to ground support roles. Miniguns were mounted in the fuselage and deployed by the pilot as the plane banked around a target on the ground. Once again, the C-47 was proving adaptable and versatile. Versatile indeed, but still subject to the ravages of time. The team at Basler were hoping simply to recover the original ailerons, but after removing the old fabric and having cleaned the metal, they discovered they needed a much more thorough and time-intensive restoration. The team set about replacing corroded parts, reusing as much of the original structure as possible and recovering with new fabric, employing the same skills she would have recognized when first built.
So here we have a C-47 aileron, and one thing that when you see it off you get a sense of the scale of it. The control surfaces on most World War II airplanes were fabric covered because fabric was a non-strategic material. Aluminum was in short supply. And they also knew that lighter control surfaces flew better and were less susceptible to flutter. And so many of the World War II airplanes, up to and including the high-speed fighters, had fabric control surfaces on it. So fabric is an old skill. Some would say a lost art, but it's obviously alive and well here in Wisconsin.
Meanwhile, the engines have returned after being fully overhauled, and the CAF are one step closer to their dream of returning that soul brother to Normandy.
Now this is an 1830, Pratt & Whitney's powered 1830. Of course we're looking at a 14-cylinder twin roll radial engine, producing a little over 1,000 horse. This engine has been through the overhaul facility, completely overhauled to zero time. We have procured a new exhaust for this engine. The old exhaust has been too many years of wear and tear. The dish pan itself is new. will be, though, the original engine mount. You can see we have completely overhauled the engine mount. So the airframe, when it came to us, has been modified several times. This exhaust tunnel that we're seeing in here was completely removed, skinned over. It had a short exhaust stack put on it. We have gone back to the original. The plumbing had been modified horribly on this airplane. We've gone back to original plumbing. Of course, you can see all the controls linkages that go in here are all removed. I'm currently waiting on new bearings. The bearings were froze solid. This airplane needed a lot of TLC, and we're putting a lot of love into this girl. So she's getting new bearings put into it. Everything in this thing will be back to the way it was when it was flying coming out of the factory. It's gone from a serviceable airplane to an overhauled airframe. I love this project. It's been great. I'm really excited to see this thing get finished and get up and flying.
We're very close to installation of the remaining cockpit items, control column, connecting up flight control cables. We're in the process of doing the hydraulic and engine fuel plumbing. Following that, we'll have to run control cables and engine control cables as well as flight control cables. The engine has proven itself to be a workhorse, and this engine is expensive nowadays to overhaul or maintain, but it is really amazing if you stop to consider the engine itself, that it was designed in a time before computers and all that. So the men that not only flew it but designed it was a great generation of men.
This engine was built in great numbers during the war. Indeed, it was the most widely used aviation engine of its day. It was used not only on the C-47, but also on the most prolific bomber, the B-24. America had refined the mass production process, and, thanks to the abundance of fuel and raw materials, the US became the fastest as well as largest manufacturer of arms during the war. They manufactured planes, tanks, and warships, as well as small arms, ammunition, and field supplies, and consequently the US was one of the best equipped wartime armies.
I carried about 125 pounds on me, and I weighed 132. And some guys carried more than that, some of the bigger guys. We carried a mine. Everybody carried a tank mine. We carried about 6 grenades. We all carried about 50 feet of primacord. Most of it wrapped around our helmet. We carried 12 blasting caps in our pocket. Now in civilian life, you can't even have those in the same vehicle. When you go to buy them, you can't carry caps and explosive in the same thing. We carried them right on us. We also carried C2, which was a very powerful new type of explosive. But I carried an M1 rifle. All the non-coms carried a folding stock carbine, 30 caliber carbine. And we carried 3 days ration. That means 9 K rations. And whatever else we wanted in way of equipment. We're supposed to carry socks, but nobody did. I didn't take my boots off for the whole 30 days, and when I took them off, there was no socks. It was like Jell-O, and I just took it like that and sloughed it off my feet.
Back at Basler, and just in time, attention turns to the wings. Along with the engines, these are the final major components to be fitted, and consequently allow the team to focus more closely on her authenticity in every detail.
In the sort of landscape of warbirds, it's really interesting to observe where people's attentions and where their interests lie. If you're restoring a P-51 Mustang, you can find out the exact proportion of lamp black that was applied to the zinc chromate at North American in Inglewood, so that your Mustang can come out as a Concours winning Mustang, And you can do a similar thing with a B-17. But it hasn't been done with a C-47. They're sort of the forgotten warhorse of the war years. They carried all these men, they carried all the air cargo, they ferried the wounded back out of Normandy. In the specific case of That's All Brother, it participates in every major Allied airborne operation in the remainder of the war following D-Day. And what you can't find anywhere is any of that information. There's no book written on how to put the airplane back together or how it looked during the war. They were so ubiquitous, they went through a dozen different cockpit configurations. They soldiered on for so long after the war that there isn't one out there that survives truly unmodified, out there flying. And so for us, surveying the scale of the task and the importance of the airplane, it became really evident that if there ever was an airplane that needed to be showcased in its D-Day configuration, this would be that airplane, and that it was high time that a C-47 was restored to its wartime configuration as a tribute to the men and women who flew them.
The young airmen sitting in the cockpit of the C-47 faced fear. They faced the fear of anti-aircraft fire. They were at low altitude. Light AA fire could hit the aircraft, pierce the thin fuselage, and the pilots could sense the agitation of the paratroopers in the rear who wanted to get out and fight. And as the aircraft disgorged its parabundles and paratroopers, the centre of gravity shifted, the weight altered, the aircraft would rise. They had to keep the plane in formation and under control, and adjust and react to trim the C-47 as it shed its load over the battle zone. Many young men were lost. C-47s could be seen going down, but their job was to focus, to make sure that they got their aircraft over the drop zone.
A few weeks later, and That's All Brother is preparing for an important milestone in the restoration, the testing of her engines. Though every precaution has been taken, these are always anxious moments.
The engines are freshly overhauled. It's an absolutely critical time when all of the mechanics and the people who've been in charge of the restoration have been finishing the different systems on the airplane, verify that all of those things are functional before we put pilots in the airplane and attempt to take off.
Sparks are noted, checked on the run. Nope. Aircraft and area clear. Yep. Gear lock pins
Installed.
Wheels are chock.
Chocks
here. Oil quantity 15 gallons minimum.
It was checked before we left the hangar. I got mixtures of cutoff, throttles at idle, and props are forward. We are ready for an engine start.
Need more hydraulic fluid. Taking pictures of my mess.
The team can never foresee every eventuality, proving the need for such tests, but the problem is very swiftly identified and resolved.
We did have a bit of a false start. A hydraulic fitting broke loose and we suffered quite a significant leak. But within just a few short minutes, the problem was traced to the hydraulic panel, to an original component. And with a quick replacement, the airplane is now back ready. The second engine run was conducted, and the airplane was run up successfully.
Dave, are we ready to make history again?
So,
3, 6, 9, 12, 15.
History's coming alive. It is absolutely outstanding. We still need to put the engine cowling on. It hasn't been cowled. Cowling has to be adjusted. We haven't got a full ground run as far as pulling all the power that these engines will pull to make sure that they're going to hold together. Great confidence that they will. We just haven't quite got there. As soon as we get the rest of the engine indications up and running, we'll be pulling power on them. We really need to get a gear swing in. We haven't got the gears swung yet, but there really is not a lot of maintenance left to be done. We're really close for first flights. As anybody in the aviation industry knows, not till the paperwork's done.
Perhaps the most special thing about it was as the aircraft approached full throttle on the engines, you could see it just sort of shake in the chocks. You could see lift forming under the wings and under the tail. And as the airplane sat there jumping up and down, I don't think there was anyone among us who couldn't imagine how exciting it was going to be to see this airplane fly. The sentiment is that it wants to fly at this point. After 3 years of restoration and more than 22,000 man-hours, the airplane is ready, and we are very nearly ready to let it fly.
The plane wants to fly, but can she? Will she make it back to Normandy? Her second defining moment awaits her.